Hey there, eighth grader Kaola innovators. Put together a few slides here, a little bit of a lesson that I want to use for the first part of Unit 2. The Unit 2 is the colonization of America, and your first quiz is on the competition of colonial control. So I wanted to kind of walk you through a little lesson that you can use to complete your review handout for the quiz. Hopefully you should find all of the answers in this presentation that will go along with your review handout, and should be a good review of what you read a little bit about in the first few lessons. So the first quiz is called Competition for Colonial Control, and it is really about how 4 European countries all were competing to try to gain territory, both through exploration and trade, in North America. And you'll see here on this map that the 4 countries are labeled with 4 different colored arrows. There's the Dutch, the English, the French, and the Spanish. And you can see how each of them came into certain areas. Now the Dutch and the English settled in a lot of the same areas, but the Spanish and the French had their own parts of North and sometimes South America that they were beginning to compete for. So we're going to look at all 4 of those countries, the Dutch, the English, the French, and the Spanish, look at some of their settlements, as well as what they were able to do in their colonial practices. So the first of the countries that we're going to look at, if I can get the slide to move. There we go. It's the Spanish. And so you'll see here on this map that the Spanish started with their expansion in this area right down in here, with Ponce de Leon and his expedition into what we now call Florida, and then De Soto, which you actually learned about both of these explorers in our last unit, but De Soto having come up here in the Mississippi River area. So the Spanish started down in the southern part of North America. And then they also began to explore out here in the Southwest. And again, some of these names are some that we had in our first unit on exploration. So Coronado, for example, explored a lot of the Southwest, including the Grand Canyon area. But then also there began the use of Catholic missions. And these were mostly set up in California and in New Mexico. And these were set up by priests who came and wanted to not only explore for the adventure, but also wanted to set up religious institutions. So in California, from San Diego to San Francisco, there were these different missions. This is a picture here of Sarah. He was one of the priests who set up missions in California. Another priest, Kino, was in Arizona. And then there were other people who weren't priests, who were just explorers like Peralta and Portola, who also came into the Southwest area. So the Spanish were mostly in the southern area, the Florida area, but also in the Southwest and the West. The Spanish also didn't just bring religion, they also were bringing products with them that became instrumental in the development of America. And in this case, it's mostly livestock and cattle ranching, which became, of course, a major business and continues to be a business in the southwestern part, like Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona in the United States today. And it was the Spanish explorers and settlers who brought those ideas. The Spanish also are responsible for the very first city in the United States, and that's St. Augustine, Florida. And it was a settlement that was built by a man named Menendez, and it is considered the oldest city in the United States. And the Spanish wanted to put this settlement because they were, worried that the French were going to come in. There was competition between all these countries. And so the Spanish felt like, hey, if we go there and we build a little fort and we build some buildings and we make a city here, we can keep the French from invading our area and taking over our colonial holdings. So St. Augustine, Florida, if you've never been there to visit, is considered the oldest city in the United States, and it was established by the Spanish. If you look at this map, you can see the orange down here is what we were just talking about, the Spanish in Florida and in the Southwest. But another of the large European countries who were competing were the French. That's this big blue area, mostly in Canada and in the Mississippi River Valley. So the French started their exploration with two people who you recognize from our last unit, and that's Cartier and Champlain. So Cartier in the 1500s began exploration of the St. Lawrence River, which is sort of separates the United States and Canada today. And then Champlain set up the very first French settlement, the first one for the French people, French country, and that was in Quebec, which of course is today a very large city in Canada. It's right up here on the map. And it was founded in 1608 by Champlain. So the French started their expansion in the Canadian, northern United States territory, but then they began to expand it down the Mississippi River. And again, this hits a lot of the same kind of exploration that we saw in our first unit. But La Salle, he began the exploration down the Mississippi all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And he's this, on this map, it's this green line here, all right, is his one that went all the way down to the Mississippi. You also read about Marquette and Joliet. That's a picture over here of them. Also explorers in the Mississippi River. Marquette was a priest. Joliet was an explorer. They founded the first European settlement in the state, what we today would call Michigan. D. Bienville actually founded the city of New Orleans down here at the bottom in 1718 for the French. And this is a sign of a guy named Celeron. And Celeron, he led what they call the Lead Plate Expedition, which was to advance the French territory in the Ohio Valley, which is sort of up on the map here. Where's my mouse? I lost it. There it is. Is right up in this area. And he would go around and put these lead plates out to show that the French were coming to dominate. So the French were mostly centered around the Mississippi River. And that was because this was an important part for really two things for the French. Obviously, they wanted to explore. It was there for adventure. They wanted to make money. But they also were interested in some particular products and one particular issue, and that was religion. So one of the big businesses in the Mississippi River Valley and in Canada was fur trading. And so a lot of French and other European countries were part of the fur trade. And they would send people there who would trap them, the animals, and then they would obviously trade for their furs. They also would trade with Native Americans to get furs from those. So a lot of the French who went there were trappers or traders. Then there were also a lot of priests, as we talked about with the Spanish. The French also saw Christianity and saw religion as one of the motives for colonizing and competing for colonial holdings. So Marquette, for example, was another priest who went, and in part he was exploring, but he was also trying to spread his religious beliefs. So that's the French. The French were primarily in the Mississippi River Valley and in Canada, but they were not the only ones. Remember, there are 4 major countries that were competing for colonial control, and another of the European countries are the Dutch. So the Dutch did not have nearly the amount of land as our other European countries, mostly just this little piece here, and actually they didn't hold it for long because eventually they were going to turn it over to the British. But the Dutch, the country is called the Netherlands, but we call the people who come from the Netherlands the Dutch. So it's the country is the Netherlands, but the people are called the Dutch. And they were primarily really just interested in one place, and that was the Hudson River, which is this blue line right here on the map that runs down through eastern New York into the top part of New Jersey and ends down here in the Hudson Bay, which today is right in New York City. So the Dutch were most interested in that area. And it started with Henry Hudson, who you saw in our last unit, is the explorer who landed in North America. He was actually British, but he sailed for the Dutch, and he landed for the Dutch East India Company, and he sailed in Canada, but then he also sailed in the Hudson River down here. And again, like the French, the Dutch were really interested in the fur trade. They also were the people responsible for the founding of Manhattan. So an explorer named Peter Minuit joined the Dutch West Indian Company, which was like the Dutch East India Company, interested in establishing a trade. And he negotiated with the Native Americans, the Lenape tribe, to purchase Manhattan Island. And Manhattan Island then became known as the city of New Amsterdam, which today is known as New York City. So the Dutch were the first people to settle there. And unlike a lot of the other European colonial powers, the Dutch very much wanted to encourage families to settle in the colonies because they wanted to bring men and women and their children so that businesses could develop. A lot of the other colonial powers were really more interested in just bringing individual men. The last of our countries to compete are the British. And so you'll see here on the map, they're this pink color. You'll notice it's actually where we just talked about with the Dutch. And that's because the British eventually took over the territory that the Dutch had once had. But this became British. And in 1664, the English took over New Amsterdam and renamed it New York City. So the British are our last of our colonial countries. So sometimes in your readings they're called the English and sometimes they're called the British. So are they the same? Well, generally speaking, yes. English are people who come from England, and England is one part of Great Britain. And so in the context of colonialism, if they call them the English or the British, they are basically coming from England or Great Britain, and at this point that's the same thing. So the British were really interested in expanding into Canada, but also into the Atlantic coast. So Cabot claimed most of the Atlantic coast in the Canadian area for England, and then you'll see on this map then the British started to move their way down this coast north, of North America, including where we live, which was originally settled by the British. So Queen Elizabeth was instrumental in starting the British colonial expansion, and she gave charters, and one of those charters was to Sir Walter Raleigh, this man down here who has a really funky hat and a interesting little neck piece, and he was the person responsible. Raleigh was responsible for exploring and settling the Chesapeake Bay region, as well as most of Virginia and North Carolina today. Two areas that you read a little bit about that are examples of British colonialism. One is Roanoke Island. This is where Sir Walter Raleigh landed in 1585. It's actually in North Carolina, and it was the first permanent English colony, but the settlers disappeared, and that's why it's called the Lost Colony. They were there. They had a governor and a mayor, Mr. White, who was living there. He left to go get some resources back in England. When he came back, everybody was gone. And so that's sort of the Roanoke Island story, is that they either ended up moving in and living with Native Americans in order to try to survive, or they all died. Something happened to them, but they were gone. And the settlement of Roanoke Island was from the London Company, which was a British company, with the purpose of trying to set up these settlements. And the London Company is going to step in after Roanoke Island and help with the second big settlement, which of course was Jamestown. So Jamestown is in Virginia. It was the first permanent English settlement because, of course, the Lost Colony was lost. And 3 ships landed there. John Smith, who is this man in the picture, was the president, and he started exploring. The people there ran out of a lot of food. They needed the Native Americans, who did help them at first because they wanted to be friends with them. Eventually, the friendship kind of fell apart, which you'll see in the video. But by 1610, most of the settlers had died. They had spent too much time building buildings, looking for gold, trying to do things that weren't really about growing food. And so it pretty much failed. There were a few people who remained there for a little while, but it didn't work out very well at Jamestown. And I have a clip that I'm going to put on the Google site that I would like for you to watch that talks a little bit about both Roanoke Island and Jamestown. And so this hopefully will give you some ideas about how these four countries, the British, the French, the Dutch, and the Spanish, all were competing to control North America. And then obviously as we move through this unit, we'll look at how that is. So this clip I will put in on the Google site, so please make sure you watch that when you get an opportunity. Hope this is helpful. Hope to see you guys soon. Bye-bye.